First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for the invitation to speak at this conference, and I thank you all for coming this morning. And so, yes, my topic is the ethics of Cold War literature, Alexandra Solzhenytsyn's national during the Cold War and its afterlife. So, on the one hand, I will be talking about Solzhenitsyn a little bit, but my main focus is really on how to deal with his work and how we can deal with his work ethically, and also talk about how it was dealt with in the Cold War, and to discuss the decisions that were made. So first of all, I assume that most people know who Solzhenitsyn was, but in case this isn't, if you don't, Alexandra Solzhenitsyn was one of the most prominent dissidents of the Soviet dissident movement from the 1960s and 70s. He was born in Kislovodsk, 1918, and he died here in Moscow, 2008. And he was mainly known for his work on the Soviet prison camps. His first published work was A Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich in 1962 in Novy Mir, the famous the famous journal. So his reputation was basically based on this aspect of his work, that he was a writer who wrote about the prison camps, and this was a theme that he chose because he was indeed a witness of the prison camps. He had been 8 years in several Soviet prison camps, and so he experienced this himself. But he was also a writer who was very prolific. He wrote a lot of different works on different subjects, and he was also someone who saw his work as having political significance and also ethical significance. And this was also the way that other people saw him. So politics and ethics find a place in the reception of Solzhenitsyn and also in his own work. And and some of his ideas were problematic and some were less problematic, but in general, in the Soviet Union, he did not have the freedom to really publish everything he wanted. When he published the Archipelago Gulag, this book that I'm showing you here, he was actually kicked out of the country. He was sent into exile, and he lived in the US for about 20 years before he returned to Russia. So he was a person who really experienced the effect of censorship in the Soviet Union, but he was also someone who had political convictions that did not please everybody. So he was a very complex writer. And so the context of my research is basically that I wrote my PhD thesis on the Western reception of Alexandra Solzhenitsyn. And if you're interested, the book has been published. I put some flyers back in the book table. And what I studied was basically his reception before and after 1991. I focused on printed reception, so I didn't do any interviews. And I focused on 3 different countries, the US, the UK, and West Germany. I chose the US because it was one of the most important countries in the Cold War, in the Cold War conflict, and it was also his home for 20 years. The UK, because US and British scholars, they are often moving around, so it's very difficult to make a very clear cut. So that's one reason, but another reason is I wanted to have one European country that was not Germany, but I also wanted to have Germany. And the reason why I wanted to have Germany was, for one thing, because of the separation between East and West. So there was this already a Cold War conflict there that was very interesting, that made Solzhenitsyn's reception very interesting and very tantalizing, but also because Solzhenitsyn was known in many Western countries as someone who brought the topic of the Soviet prison camps into a wider discussion and to a wider consciousness. So in the US, a lot of people believe that he was actually the first person to write about this subject. Often when you read literary histories of Russian literature in English, you come up with a claim that Ivan Denisovich was the first book written on this subject. However, this was not the case. And in Germany, there was a very a strong consciousness of the prison camps and of prison camp literature from the Soviet Union, because even in the 1930s and 40s, during the Nazi era, there were a lot of publications on this subject. Some of them were Nazi propaganda, and others were just things that had been written somewhere else, but they were published there. So already then there was this consciousness about the prison camps, and afterwards, of course, in the 1950s, when the German prisoners of war came back from the Gulag, they also wrote about this. So there was this very strong consciousness about this subject, and that affected, of course, the way Solzhenitsyn was seen. So he was seen as someone who wrote about the Gulag and who was important for this, but other political aspects of his work had resonance as well. I did not take France because its reception is quite similar to the US, so it didn't add anything new, and I didn't take Russia because most of the time during the Cold War there was no freedom to publish a really open discussion on Solzhenitsyn. So there were some comments upon his work, but they were mostly speaking out the opinion of the state on his work. So it was very unequal. And as I said, I focused on printed reception, so I didn't take any blogs or internet information from the post-Soviet period. Right, so I think that it's important to note that in general, the reception of the Gulag Archipelago is what actually shaped Solzhenitsyn's reputation, and it is also the work for which he is remembered the best. So if we take this as an example, we can see generally what were the issues that were discussed in his work, because I did study the reception of other works, but this is really the one that defined him the most, and it was also the strongest, the moment where he was most famous, because when Gulag was published in December 1973, and then he was arrested, and then in February 1974 he was he put on a plane and sent to Germany. That caused a worldwide shock somehow, that a writer had just been thrown out like that. So there was a lot of discussion on this work, because actually sending him into exile was the strongest form of how can I say, of attention. Like it really brought the attention of the world to this book. It was like I don't know, like almost a marketing strategy for the book from the Soviet side. It was very, very odd, the effect that it caused. So officially, the type of criticism that was given in the Soviet Union, I did read that, because in some countries, people who criticized Solzhenitsyn's book, the Gulag Archipelago, they were accused of being communists who were just repeating Soviet propaganda. So I had a look and saw what was the Soviet reasoning, what was the argument behind throwing Solzhenitsyn out. And so basically in the 1970s, when the book came out and he was thrown out, the reason why he was criticized was the positive portrayal of Tsarism in his book, and also of Nazism, and of those who collaborated with Nazis. And this was all seen as slander of the Russian nation. So that's how it was interpreted. That was the interpretation offered. And this was from the articles that appeared in Pravda, and also I looked at the book Archipelago of Lies, which was a propaganda book criticizing Solzhenitsyn, that was published in the Soviet Union in English. And the conclusion in Gulag Archipelago that state crimes were an inherent part of socialism and not a deviation from it, that also caused a lot of anger. And also the disrespect for the memory of victims who were communist. That was also one reason why it was criticized. In West Germany, there were some leftists who were aggravated by the positive portrayal of Nazis and their collaborators, but those were mainly authors who wrote in left-wing, in smaller left-wing newspapers. However, in the mainstream press, liberal press and conservative press, there was the impression that these people were really just repeating Soviet propaganda. But when I read these texts, I realized that this was not really the case, because these people were often people who had been in concentration camps for being communists. So they had this experience, and they felt very insulted that Solzhenitsyn, he actually wrote in the Gulag Archipelago that the Gestapo was interested in finding out the truth as opposed to the KGB. So and this claim was really painful for people who were victims of Nazism, because this was not true. And in Germany, there was also the problem that Solzhenitsyn in Gulag Archipelago, as in other books, he claims that there was that Germans actually had a lot of trials where they sent people to jail for their crimes during World War II. So he praised them for the way they dealt with the Nazi past, but he inflates the number of people convicted. So it was 10% of what he claimed. But a lot of people in Germany, a lot of journalists and scholars, they were very glad that he said that, and said, oh yes, we have dealt with our past, and now we can put it behind us and never talk again about the subject. So there was very, very specific German reading of this work. And of course, right-wingers, on the other hand, they took the book and they said, oh, in the Gulag Archipelago, Solzhenitsyn says that a Jew invented the Soviet labor camps, and so it was justified to do what the Nazis did to the Jewish people in 1933 to 45. So there was this very, well, you can see how different aspects came up in his reception in West Germany, but there were also some things that were in common with other countries. There were conservative anti-communists who embraced it as a legitimation of their claims about how evil communism was, but left-wing anti-communists and other people just generally viewed it as a history of the prison camps with political implications, which was written by a witness. So this was the general idea that was implied. And in the US and UK, in many cases, it also set a standard in the calculation of victims of communism, although there was a disagreement regarding the analytical conclusion of the book. So this is the general results of how this book was seen, and also how Solzhenitsyn as an author was regarded. And after the Cold War, there was, actually before the end of the Soviet Union, the book was published in Russia in 1989, but there was less resonance than initially expected. And but since 2009, it's part of the federal school curriculum, so it has become an important book again. The book is read in an abridged, as in a shortened form. In the US and UK, and also in Germany, in general terms, it is remembered as a groundbreaking work of political literature and of witness literature. But at the same time, it has lost a lot of its relevance. It's not read as much. However, in the US, there are a lot of Christian scholars who continue to read this book, especially the chapters about spirituality in the camps, because they agree with these aspects. On the other hand, in Germany, right-wingers continue to use it to justify Nazi policies or anti-Semitic arguments. So you already can see that the reception of Solzhenitsyn shows us that there are certain controversial aspects in his work. Of course, he was a witness of the prison labor camps, and I think that it was very important that he wrote about this, and that he was so insistent on having the freedom to write about this subject, and to have freedom to write about whatever he wanted. I think that it was a very important struggle that he fought. On the other hand, when we look at his work as a whole, and also when we look at specific works that were very strongly political, such as the Gulag Archipelago, but also his work on Russian Jewish history called 200 Years Together, or a work like August 1914 or November 1916, these books all have a very strong a very coherent ideological picture, and when I think that I can safely say that it does. We do have I do have the impression that there is nationalism in his work, and I'm not alone in this impression. And when I speak of nationalism, I use Yitzhak Brudny's definition of nationalism, who is a scholar who wrote about nationalism, intellectual nationalism in the Brezhnev era. And he defines Russian nationalism in this context as follows. This concept designates groups of intellectuals, organizations, and since the late 1980s, political parties that asserted that the Russian nation is that terminal community to whom ultimate loyalty is owed, and made claims to speak in its behalf, especially concerning the political, social, economic, and cultural arrangements best suited for the Russian nation. So, in the case of Solzhenitsyn, he really became part of this movement of Russian nationalism that started to grow in the 1970s and then went on, of course. There are certain aspects that are very important, the loyalty to the nation, of course, but also the notion of ethno-nationalism, and also, indeed, of ethnodoxy, the word that was used by Edwin on Monday, the notion that Russian people are Christian Orthodox. And there's a big sense of a struggle between us and them in his work, between the Russian people and other people. And there are also many cases of anti-Semitism in his work, and also an instrumentalization of alleged or factual victimhood of the Russian people. We have already heard many times about how, in some cases, the argument is put forward that the Russian people were sacrificing themselves for other peoples in the Soviet era, and that the minorities and that the other Soviet republics, they were actually getting all the privileges and all the best part, and the Russians were being discriminated. So this alleged victimhood is something that we find over and over again in his work. But there are also other issues that are problematic, such as his anti-feminism, his negative views on emancipated women, and also his views on rape. Homophobia, suspicion of multi-party democracy, and the emphasis on the role of the church in state affairs, which is something that some people might agree or disagree with, but they are controversial as such. Now, I don't know how you see this anti-Semitism question. I know that a lot of, I read a lot of texts from his reception, so obviously I know that a lot of people doubt that he was anti-Semitic, and I think that for me it's not interesting to know what he was as a person, but I know that for sure what he presented in his work did have anti-Semitic content. And what I mean by that is that he saw Jewish people as foreign to Russian, despite the fact that he himself claimed that they were in Russia for at least 200 years. So why were they not a part of this country? On the other hand, he also attributes some negative features, such as, for example, he claims in several instances that they are always thinking about money, and that they also tend to they have a stronger tendency to be revolutionaries, and that they are unthankful towards the state where they live, and so on. So he really shows them as a group that acts as a group. And the problem is that he also Judaizes certain criminals in Soviet and Russian history in order to make very radical claims about the Jewish people. And one of the examples, and you don't have to read this long quote, but one of the examples that I think makes it most clear is the fact that in his book August 1914, and also in the book 200 Years Together, he presents the idea that Dmitry Bogrov, a revolutionary and double agent who killed the Prime Minister Stolypin in 1911, that he was, not only does he claim that this man was Jewish, but he also claims that because he was Jewish, then there was a chain reaction that caused the killing of the Kiev Jews in 1941 by the Germans. So he creates a connection between what happened in 1911 and 1941. And this is based, his argument is based on the notion that Bogrov was Jewish. Now, according to the data available, to all the archival data, Bogrov was already in the third generation baptized Jew, so you would have to be have a very strongly racial definition of Jewish in order to call him that. He did not practice any religion at all, and he was an anarchist double agent. So there were other reasons why he killed Bogrov, but in Solzhenitsyn's book, he killed them because he grew up in a Jewish environment full of hatred towards Russia, and he felt compelled to commit this crime. So he is already accusing basically the entire group of this crime, and then causes this anti-Semitic chain of events. And I will read that because it's very, very clear what he makes out of the situation. So he writes, first step, Stolypin is killed, nerves are lost at war, and Russia lies under the boots of the Bolsheviks. Second step, despite all gruesomeness, the Bolsheviks end up being much less talented than the Tsarist government. Within a quarter of a century, they quickly hand over half of Russia to the Germans, including Kiev. Third step, Hitler's troops easily reach Kiev and destroy Kievite Jewry. The same Kiev, also in September, only 30 years after Bogrov's shot. So you can see how he makes this connection. Now the problem is not only that I'm not saying that it's anti-Semitic to believe in fate, but it's not fate, because this only applies to Jewish people. So the Germans who killed the Jews, they didn't have any fateful end or some sort of punishment for what they did. And any other criminal that he mentions who is not Jewish does not have cause such horrible things. So this idea of fate only applies to Jewish people, and he argues this in 200 let mjeste in order to invite the Jews to repent for these sins. Now, this is incredibly cruel to say that what one person does causes all these deaths. But on the other hand, to say that only for one group, I think that's even more incendiary. And so the thing is, there are problematic things in Solzhenitsyn's work, and they are coherent in their ideology. But the problem is that during the Cold War, there was a certain vision of what it meant to be ethical as a literary scholar or as a scholar in dealing with books like Solzhenitsyn's books. The thing is that during the... did it change? No. During the Cold War, there was a lot of talk about morality and about ethics in dealing with Soviet literature. And because of the censorship and the restraints in publishing in the Soviet Union, a lot of scholars of Russia, be they literary scholars or just scholars who wrote about literature but were possibly not literary scholars, but from another discipline, they felt that, or they often defined morality and ethics in their work as an opposition towards Stalin and all he represents. So there were some authors, such as, for example, the famous British scholar Max Hayward. He wrote that it was necessary to draw a line between the books that were printed in the Soviet Union and that agreed with the state and those who did not. And for him, this line was really between good and bad. So there was a very, very strict view that to be ethical as a scholar in an assessment of this type of literature was to say, if there is an opposition towards Stalinism, if there is a criticism of the crimes of the Soviet state, then this book must be promoted, that this book is good, it has passed the test. Outside of a Cold War context, there is a more nuanced use of the words morality and ethics. On the one hand, morality is used in a more personal, more individual, as more way. And for example, Terry Eagleston, he uses the definition: what makes human beings flourish and find fulfillment, and under what political conditions this would be possible. That is morality in literature. So it's very, very personal in a way. And ethics, on the other hand, are more understood as professional ethics in general. What is the correct behavior of the profession? What serves the community best? What is more truthful? But in the Cold War, this was really turned into a black and white decision between, that was decided by the way that that authors dealt with Stalinism. So it was really the most important aspect. And and the thing is that during the Cold War, there were also views about what was unethical. So it was not only a view about what was ethical, but also what is unethical. And what I was very surprised to find out is that there are actually there were a lot of literary scholars who viewed it as unethical to talk about other aspects of Solzhenitsyn's work, except his opposition to Stalinism and his testimony of the camps. But that included even aesthetic aspects. So there were actually some literary scholars who said we cannot talk about the aesthetic aspects of his work because his testimony is so important. So it wasn't just the political things. It wasn't just about not talking about nationalism or anti-Semitism, but also not talking about things that are actually at the center of literary scholarship. Of course, not everyone saw it that way, but a lot of people saw it that way, and that I was very surprised to find that out. Also, there was the view, especially from political scientists who wrote about Solzhenitsyn. They said it is unethical to oppose Solzhenitsyn for being nationalism, as anything is better than communism. So nationalism couldn't be that bad. So that was a position, for example, of John Dunlop, who wrote about Solzhenitsyn quite a lot about him. And he said, well, he is nationalist, but everything is better than communism, so that's okay. And I also saw how many scholars and journalists who were worried about Solzhenitsyn's nationalism and how his reputation, because he had the reputation of being a moral icon, and they were concerned that this positive reputation would cause would legitimize the more problematic aspects of his work, such as anti-Semitism or his homophobia and other aspects. But so these scholars, they were often bullied, and I noticed that because often when they wrote an article, there was later on a letter to the editor insulting them, or Solzhenitsyn himself insulted them and created conspiracy theories about them, and that was a really very negative atmosphere. I mean, it's really painful to read some of the things, especially because Solzhenitsyn also often accused people, or if they're Russian or non-Russian, of being KGB agents if they disagreed with him, and that was something that really affected people. Like there were some German journalists who they almost lost their job for that. There were people in the US who lost their job for that. There was a Russian journalist in Germany who lost his job because of this accusation. So these things really had an effect. And I know that it may sound weird because, of course, in the West there was more freedom of speech than in Russia. That is obvious. I'm not questioning that. But there was also a very strong, a very polarized atmosphere that caused this one-sided view. And wait a second. Yeah, so the thing is that this was a situation that basically created the reputation that Solzhenitsyn has, because without this polarized view, we would not, he would not have the positive reputation that he has today. Like if everybody knew his ideas, I don't think he would have the same reputation. So what happened after the Cold War was basically that, as much as some observers might have wished otherwise, his reception really survived only among very selected groups in the West, because anti-communism really defined him. And after communism was gone as a threat, then it was not interesting anymore for most people. And the importance of Solzhenitsyn has actually grown a lot since the year 2000. And as you know, Putin met him quite a few times, and Putin was also behind the decision to make him part of the school curriculum. So that's the latest on his reception. But as I said, the notion that he is a moral example is very strong still, and also the Russian government has asked the UNESCO that the year 2018 will be Solzhenitsyn year because of his moral standing, and that would be the 100-year anniversary of his birth. So let's see. So now to my questions. Just a second. Yeah, there we go. So actually what I want to talk about with you is basically that we look back at the Cold War and the decisions that were made there, and we look at the way that during the Cold War a more nuanced perception of Solzhenitsyn was actually drowned out, and there was basically that created his reputation as mainly as a witness author and a Gulag author, although he himself actually saw that differently. He did not believe, and he claimed this, and not only in interviews but also in many of his memoirs, that not the Gulag Archipelago was his most important work, but his series on the fall of the Russian Empire, the Red Wheel series. So that was what he claimed was the most important work. But this was absolutely not the way he was regarded, and until today he is remembered as a witness of the Gulag and as an important moral icon as a result. So for those of you who agree that it is important to talk about the Gulag, but that Solzhenitsyn does have some problematic issues in his work, I would like to ask you, was it the right decision to adopt this black and white view on Soviet literature in the Cold War? And was it just mirroring the way that the Soviet system was dealing with literature? Was it just, was making politics, and I mean a very black and white view of politics, the most important criteria? Was that a good way or a bad way to deal with it? And given the discrepancy between Solzhenitsyn's worldwide reputation and the content of his work, did it make sense to make him the icon that he is today? And how can we as scholars be more precise in our judgments in a polarized context? And we have conflicts in the world all the time, maybe not as clear-cut as back in the day, but still there are a lot of issues that, where there's a big disagreement, and I wonder if it wouldn't be more sensible to be more precise and more nuanced in assessments, and not create new icons who might end up being very problematic. Because the authors that Ducha was talking about, I mean, it's so obvious that they are anti-Semitic. I mean, one would only need to look at some of the covers of the books, and so you buy that and you know what you're getting. But in the case of Solzhenitsyn, he has such a reputation that people buy these books and they don't really know what they're getting. So I think that there is a discrepancy that is worth talking about, and I would really love to hear what you think about it. So thank you very much.